Okay, so here we have a version of Mardu Pyromancer. This is my own list that I've been working with and tuning, so I apologize if you're looking for the typical Mardu list, but there's a few cards here that you don't normally see in Mardu, and I do think that they're good for what that's worth, so I'll talk about those. Um, Mardu Pyromancer, I'd say within the past year or so, it's been one of the top modern mid-range decks. I think mid-range has fallen off in the past couple months a little bit, but Mardu is still one of the best Thoughtseize decks, best Inquisition of Kozilek decks in the format, if not the very best one. The mana base, we got the 4 Blackleaf Cliffs, of course. Not really too much to say about that. Some discard spells. Then we got Faithless Looting. So Faithless Looting is one of the more important cards in the deck because it allows you to get cards into the graveyard, which is huge because you're just trying to get a lot of instants and sorceries in there to fuel your Bedlam Revelers. And then since there's also Lingering Souls is also one of the more important cards in the deck. And one great thing about Faithless Looting is you can put cards with flashback into the graveyard, and so then even though Faithless Looting isn't exactly netting you cards per se, if you're discarding cards with flashback and then getting value out of them later, it ends up working out pretty well, and it's a card that allows you not to flood, it allows you to draw more Faithless Lootings, and then once you're casting your Bedlam Revelers, you're actually netting multiple cards. So Faithless Looting is one of the most important cards in the deck because it allows you to just keep your engine going. Lingering Souls is also extremely important. It's the only major white card in the deck. We do also have one copy of Lightning Helix and one copy of Nahiri the Harbinger. Speaking of Nahiri the Harbinger, I started to see it pop up a little bit more, but it hasn't been in Mardu recently, until just recently rather. So it's just a very versatile option. It's another discard spell, so it's another way to get cards into your graveyard, loot through your library, similar to Faithless Looting. Hey, if you had 5 Faithless Lootings, if you had access to them, you would play them. So Nahiri is kind of another card like that, and it's been pretty good. It's just very versatile. Sometimes exiling the card that you're targeting with Nahiri is pretty important. We have Blood Moon, so 2 copies of Blood Moon. Blood Moon is, sometimes you'll see normally between 1 and 3 in Mardu. I've gone with 2 in the main with some basics along with the Blood Moon, so you can get the plains or basic swamps in order to cast it, and it's very matchup dependent. Great against your Tron decks and your Scapeshift decks. And then a lot of times you board it out, so it's high variance, and it's the only spell besides Nahiri that isn't an instant or sorcery for your Bedlam Revelers. Colligan's Command allow you to continue that value chain of getting your important creatures back from the graveyard. Since there aren't very many creatures in the deck, there's the 4 copies of Young Pyromancer and the 4 copies of Bedlam Reveler. And then Young Pyromancer is one of those ways to help you gain an advantage by having so many instants and sorceries in the deck. And then there's also a bunch of removals. So you have 2 Fatal Push, you have the bolts. A lot of your cards can be removal, like the Colligan's Command. And then a variety of 2-mana cards here. So any type of creature-based matchup, you're going to normally have access to some amount of removal for their early plays, and that's pretty important. Couple of sources of life gain against your burn decks or your aggressive decks in the Brutality and the Helix. And one card that I like that basically no one plays is Night's Whisper. So this deck just wants to be drawing a lot of cards. Night's Whisper draws you cards for 2 mana. Sometimes you don't have a looting, and it just helps filter your hand out. And it's also a sorcery to put in the graveyard, so it's good against any deck that's not like burn or super aggressive. and that's why I'm playing one in the main and one in the sideboard. So speaking of the sideboard, being that we're a 3-color midrange deck, we have access to a lot of different cards in the board. So most lists go with either Leyline or Surgical, right? Here, I have both. And the reason why is, first of all, against the graveyard decks like Dredge or like Dredge Vine or any Vengevine deck, the graveyard decks, you can never have too much graveyard removal, right? And for game one, they are very bad matchups. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that there's a bunch of matchups where Leyline is good or Surgical is good, but they're not both equally as good. Like, for example, against Tron, you really want Surgical because you have Molten Rain. You can actually get Tron lands into the graveyard and then Surgical those Tron lands. But you're never going to board in Leyline. Again, in that matchup, it does nothing. On the flip side, say you're playing against the Mirror Match. You don't really want Surgical, or it's not as good as Leyline. Surgical is still fine, but it's no Leyline of the Void. Similarly to against Hollow One, Leyline of the Void is really good. Surgical's it's fine, and you can still board in both, by the way, but it's not as good as Leyline. So that's kind of my reasoning. I also hate the idea of having to feel like I need to mulligan to a Leyline. I feel like by playing 3, you're just saying, hey, if it's in your opening hand, great. But I'm not just going to mulligan until I find it. I can still play a fair game, and I have these Surgicals in my deck that I can draw into. So Surgical is a card that you can draw into, and it's an instant and sorcery for these other cards like the Pyromancer and Bedlam Reveler. So I think they're both good for different reasons, and that's why I've gone with the split. And 3 copies of Molten Rain for those big mana decks that are pretty bad matchups. The Night's Whisper comes in basically against everything that's not super aggressive. Kumbal is great against combo decks like KCI, Storm, and then comes in other matchups as well. Needle is very versatile. It can deal with Planeswalkers, it can deal with artifacts, and then we've got Wear Tear as a flexible artifact enchantment removal. So yeah, pretty happy with the list. Been putting in a decent amount of work with the deck. This is where it's at right now, and I'd like to showcase it for you guys today. Sweet. It looks like we are going to start things off with a mulligan. Yay! No lands. Also no lands. Not the way we wanted to start off, but what are you going to do? It's Magic. We're going to go to 5. Keep our 5. Okay, we have Night's Whisper on top, which is pretty good. And it would be an incentive not to fetch. And we have this Blood Moon, so we're up against Scapeshift, so the Blood Moon is fairly valuable in the matchup. So all hope is not lost. I'm going to get 2 basic swamps and then Night's Whisper here. With the idea that we want the basics because of Blood Moon. Don't necessarily have to play the Blood Moon yet. Because our opponent can't activate the Valakut, and that means we don't have to rush it into play. We can wait on it. Our hand, besides Blood Moon, isn't that amazing, so next turn we may just be forced to play it. Here's a Bloodbraid Elf. That's interesting. Some pretty good turn overall there for our opponent. Well, it looks like we're going to have to Blood Moon, even though we don't have... We don't have our white mana available to us, but I think we just throw the Blood Moon out there. So that's going to make things more difficult on our opponent, certainly. They only have one forest. So it's going to make things more difficult. Our opponent might have that other basic forest, but we have this Collective Brutality. We have Bedlam Reveler, but the issue with the Reveler is we don't have enough spells yet in our graveyard. Keep in mind, this was a Malta to 5. Second Valakut. Okay, another Bloodbraid Elf is bad news, actually, because our opponent has a secondary way to pressure us. We may just want to use Collective Brutality to get rid of a Bloodbraid Elf. The Sakura can get a basic forest. We're worried about potential Primeval Titans here. So this is a tough spot. If we Thoughtseize our opponent. It's pretty aggressive to Thoughtseize here. But we might get like a Primeval Titan out of our opponent's hand. That's the dilemma. We could also pitch the Thoughtseize if we don't want to cast it to this Collective Brutality, which does make some sense. Yeah, I guess I'll try that. And just use the life gain mode. It feels like the safest play to deal with what's on board, but not the safest play worrying about what's in our opponent's hand currently. So we'll see if our opponent sacks the Sakura for a forest, then that would signify Primeval Titan is going to come down. So with that being the case, we just have to take the 3 damage from the Bloodbraid and plan on using the Terminate to deal with a Primeval Titan. But if our opponent's just passing, then I guess they don't have the Titan. We should probably just Terminate here and play out the Bedlam Reveler, because we're going to have to discard that Terminate anyways. And so, yeah, we just Inquisition, see what's in our opponent's hand. Cycling a Sweltering Suns in response. Okay, so they do have another Bloodbraid Elf and then a Stomping Grounds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spells. That means we can play the Bedlam Reveler for only 3 mana. And this is what punishes us for not having that white. But we actually just didn't draw any white fetch lands, which is super frustrating. So we're now drawing into these white cards and our own Blood Moon is hurting us. So, not the best spot to be in. But at the same time, we can potentially just hold off our opponent with our Bedlam Reveler. So, pretty interesting game. Lightning Bolt. So we could bolt Bloodbraid and get in. That seems pretty reasonable, just to try to start a clock. I mean, there aren't that many cards that our opponent can draw that are relevant here. That's the good news. But we are at 6, so we know about bolts, we know about Primeval Titan. If our opponent drops a Titan, we're probably going to lose here. Just because it's a 6/6 trample. Young Pyromancer, not a bad draw. Just going to send in again with the Bedlam Reveler and play the Young Pyromancer. So we're dodging bullets here in terms of our opponent's draws. Okay, looks like they're just going to hold the Sakura back, which is good news. Another uncastable. So I like just swinging in with the Bedlam here. And just saying go again. And it looks like our opponent's breaking off as hard as we are. If we draw something like a looting here, it would be great. Oh, wow. Basic Plains, hello. Well, I think we can now attack with both of our creatures. Because if the Sakura blocks the Young Pyromancer, then we could just kill our opponent with Lightning Helix. I still kind of think we want to Helix our opponent here to protect protects us against 2 lightning bolts, basically. So I'm going to do that. Wow, okay. Well, that Blood Moon was really good in this matchup. It's the card we were looking to draw, and we drew it. So, despite the mulligan, able to find the win there. We do know about this Bloodbraid package from our opponent, so they're not just on Scapeshifts and Prime Times. Actually, we didn't even see Scapeshift, but I'm going to board in Night's Whisper and Molten Rain for sure. Those are the easy cards to come in. Can take out Fatal Push, certainly comes out. Surgical is an interesting one because what you can do is you can Molten Rain a Valakut and then Surgical Extraction it. So I think we may want a couple of those. Bolts aren't great in the matchup. Normally games don't really play out in the same way that they did in the last match. It's possible we'll see something like Tireless Tracker or other creatures, so we want some amount of removal, but Colligan's Command is also pretty good as far as removal spells go. And then the other interesting card is Come Ball, but we are expecting cards like Bolt, so I'm just not going to board it in on the draw. And okay, so we boarded in 2 surgicals, and we drew both, which is kind of awkward, but I'm going to keep, based on the fact we have looting and Night's Whisper, so we have a lot of card draw. We can discard a surgical, or even both surgicals, if we choose to do that. And there's a search getting suspended. So I am in a looting here. And I think we discard Lingering Souls and one of the surgicals. Okay, so we have the option of Inquisitioning. Molten Rain is a really good draw because it means we can Molten Rain, Valakut, and then Surgical Extraction it. So we kind of want to cast Night's Whisper. Yeah, I'm just going to Night's Whisper. Just having more cards in hand allows us to make better decisions. It's fairly likely that we'll see a creature come down to pressure us, which isn't good news, but we want to kind of filter through this hand. Okay, Bloodbraid into Bolt, so as expected, there is a creature. It's Bloodbraid Elf. So we don't actually have to Molten Rain this turn because our opponent can't use the Valakut just yet. So I think I'm going to Inquisition. Gives us a better idea of what our opponent's got. So 2 lands, Search for Tomorrow, and Roast. Well, that's a pretty bad hand. I'm going to take the Search. Not really too scared of Roast, since what we can do is we can just flash back our Lingering Souls. And then next turn we can go Molten Rain Valakut and get that out of the way. So it looks like our opponent's not going to attack, which makes sense. We could Looting, but I think it's just too good an opportunity here to pass up. So I'm going to go for the play we talked about. And then next turn we can start dumping our hand out. So we see our opponent actually found a Primeval Titan, which they can cast in 2 turns from now. Looking at the rest of our opponent's deck, we see Obstinate Balos, some Scapeshifts, a Tracker, some Packs, Reclamation Sage, Fracturing Gust. That's interesting. Anger the Gods. So, okay, a lot of different things are going on with our opponent's deck. I actually forgot to take that one out of our opponent's graveyard, but that shouldn't matter. My bad. Took the ones out of our opponent's library, which is the important thing. Sometimes casting Surgical on Moto is kind of awkward because you actually have to do the thing where you get all the cards out. So without the Valakuts, our opponent has found a pretty good card here in Obstinate Baloth. So what we can do, we know about the Roast, So we can play Young Pyromancer and then Inquisition away the Roast. And the Pyromancer allows us to start having blockers, which is pretty important. So do we want to start attacking? I think we can start. We can get in there with one spirit because we can double block a Bloodbraid Elf with our 2 tokens and take the 4 damage from the Baloth. We're certainly hoping that Primeval Titan doesn't come down this turn, but it's very possible that it does. Okay, so our opponent drew a Stomping Grounds, which allows them to cast the Primeval Titan. Which is pretty good. What we can try to do this turn is get the Bedlam Reveler out there. I'm going to start with the looting. And just discarding 2 Lingering Souls seems fine. Yeah, I do think our plan is to get the Bedlam out. Although we could flash back a Lingering Souls instead, but doesn't provide us with as much toughness. So I'm going to go for this Bedlam Reveler. We drew into a bunch of lands. That's not great. Well, I'm going to pass the turn back. Our opponent has a bunch of good draws here. We're under some pressure, for sure. What we can do is triple block the Primeval Titan, which would mean taking 4 from the Obstinate Baloth. So it puts us at effectively 1, but I think it's correct. It allows us to keep our Young Pyromancer in play. But, yep, we could get bolted here. But we have these two Lingering Souls in our graveyard. Thoughtseize is a card we will not be casting. But I think we just go ahead and Lingering Souls, just try to close out this game if we can before our opponent draws something, basically, is the plan. We know that there's a lot of cards that are going to be very good. Any sweeper, like Anger of the Gods. There's a lot of cards that our opponent could draw here, but at the same time, our clock is now pretty quick. And it does appear that our opponent bricked that last turn, so that's good. We have Faithless Lootings in the graveyard, which we can start casting. There's a Blood Moon. Although, since we already have gotten rid of those Valakuts, it's not all that relevant. So I think we're just looking at putting as quick a clock as we can on our opponent. If we attack with everything, our opponent would take 7. Feels like the right play to just get in there. I guess we could We could leave our young Pyromancer back. If our opponent takes 6, it's still fine. Alright, we'll leave the young Pyromancer back. Our opponent's going to block an elemental. Presumably they just have nothing in hand. Or else they would have cast what they had already. And that is going to be the match. Yep. So we are going to be on the play. Cool. Sounds good. And yeah, I think we keep this. Certainly have plenty of removal. Don't know how great that removal is going to be. I think we just put the Sacred Foundry into play tapped. Just to get that shockland out there without having to shock ourselves. And Foundry Street Denizen means possibly a Goblin deck. We may be playing against Goblins. Which isn't necessarily the scariest thing in the world considering our hand. We have a bunch of removal, and Lingering Souls can block a card like Foundry Street Denizen pretty well. Goblin Guide will probably eat a removal spell. Legion Loyalist is an interesting one. So this is a big attack. And we're going to have a choice as to where we point these removal spells. I think we definitely want to get rid of the Goblin Guide. And then it's a question of if we think that our opponent is going to be able to get 3 creatures attacking, but I'm kind of scared of the Legion Loyalist, so I'm just going to kill it. And then we can play our Lingering Souls to block the Foundry Street Denizen. Could play out the Young Pyromancer, but I'm not going to. We can go something like Young Pyromancer next turn. And the reason why I got rid of the Legion Loyalist is because the fact that you can attack through creature tokens is pretty great against us. But on the flip side, our opponent could have another Legion Loyalist, which would be pretty bad. Okay, Fanatical Firebrand, that can trade with one of our creatures. But I think we're in a pretty good spot here. I mean, we happily... I don't know what our opponent can have here, but I think we just put up our blocks. If this trade happens, it's good for us. Yeah, that worked out very well. Now we're just in a great spot. We have that Lingering Souls in the graveyard still, and this Young Pyromancer in hand, so we're just going to dump a bunch of tokens onto the battlefield. And with only 2 cards in hand, even though our opponent might have cards like Goblin Grenade, we're still at 15. And there's a shock. Okay. Well, I think we just continue our token value. Don't see a reason not to. We can just go Young Pyromancer plus Lingering Souls now. We get the swamp. Although I guess this is a matchup where we definitely want to board out Blood Moon. Thinking about sideboarding. It's a nice habit to get your basics like this, but it's just an irrelevant card in the matchup. It's actively good against us from our opponent's side. There's a Bushwhacker, so that's not unexpected. Once again, we have good blocks. If our opponent had a Legion Loyalist, that could be a problem. There's a Goblin Grenade. But this is just a losing battle for our opponent. So we can cast this Faithless Looting here, although it's not really doing that much if we're casting it. I think I'd rather just flashback Souls and then have Lightning Bolts available. The reason why I'm not casting it is because we just don't even really want to discard this Bolt. If we had, say, a land in hand, I would cast it because we have a good discard, but we're in such a good spot, completely unnecessary. And for the sideboard, like I mentioned, Blood Moon is the easy card to take out of our deck. We don't have any easy card to bring in, but I think Cabal is fine. This deck doesn't have a ton of non-creature spells, but they have like the grenades and the shocks that we saw. Beyond that, we do have some life loss cards, which aren't great in matchups like these, but I think we just run this. Hope for a hand like in our last hand was just great. Just being able to kill our opponent's first couple creatures, and then the fact is that the Goblin deck has a lot of 1 toughness threats in it, and our Lingering Souls trades, with multiple cards, so it's a losing fight from our opponent's side, and I think it's one of the best matchups for us. So I'd be fairly surprised to lose the match. This hand is not as good as our last one, but I do think we want to keep. Our opponent also mulliganed. We have Inquisition, and looting is just a card that we rely on to set our hand up. And the Inquisition can take a potentially a very key card from our opponent. Okay, there is the Denizen we were seeing in the last game. Since we drew this Lightning Bolt, I kind of want to just get rid of it, because unlike the previous game, we don't have any token makers just yet, so this can add, the damage from it can add up. And there's a Goblin Pile Driver. So I think we just get rid of the Denizen. There's no friends for the Goblin Pile Driver yet. Their opponent might play something, but it's going to be hard for the Pile Driver to get 2 out of hand, I think. And we're going to Inquisition no matter what, so I'm just going to do it now. And we get a Bolt, so our opponent just has that Mountain in hand, which works out really nicely. So we don't really want the Thoughtseize, because our opponent's now just top decking. So once your opponent gets into that state where they're just top decking, the cards like Thoughtseize, their value goes way down. And the Pile Driver comes in. So we could actually Bedlam Reveler here, but I don't think it makes sense to do that just yet. I am going to go for the Colligan's command, just to make our opponent discard that last card. Don't know what it is. Probably it's a land, but might as well make them discard it and then kill off the pile driver. So they're empty-handed, and it looks like it was actually a Chandra's Pyro Helix. Okay, that's an interesting card because it's a way to get rid of tokens. So we're happy to have it in the graveyard, although I think our opponent could have responded by casting it to deal us 2 damage. So still not going to cast the Reveler yet because we have cards we can play, and we might as well get the combo out first so we're not discarding it to the Bedlam Reveler. And this game is pretty much over, I think. Gonna get a Sacred Foundry. Yeah, I think now is a pretty good time for this Bedlam Reveler. We can just discard this Terminate to it, but that's the only card we're discarding. And since we have six spells in the graveyard, we can cast it for only 2 mana, which is always great. And so our draws are pretty nice also. I think I'm just gonna pass here with the Helix available. If we were under more pressure, sure, could see playing one of these, but being that we're so far ahead, just doesn't seem necessary. There's a Goblin guy. Just going to untap so we can start getting some value out of the young Pyromancer as well. And it looks like our opponent has seen enough. That is going to be... Okay, so it looks like our opponent has mulliganed. And this is a fine hand. We have a turn 1 discard spell, and we also have a turn 2 discard spell potentially with the Collective Brutality and then the Blood Moon. So a couple of these cards we don't know how strong they're going to be because we don't know what the matchup is yet. So we have the option here of fetching or playing the Blackleaf Cliffs. I'm going to fetch to get a basic. What this does is that this is going to thin our deck a little bit, and it's going to mean we have one of our swamps in play if we want a Blood Moon. And we see now that our opponent is actually playing Burn. So we have a few different options in terms of what we want to take. We see the Eidolon can immediately come down next turn. We do have the Brutality on the other hand, which can get rid of it. So for that reason, I think we are fine with the Eidolon coming down. I'll just take a Bolt. Pretty happy to have the Collective Brutality in hand for this particular matchup. And our opponent probably realizes that we have a removal. Sorry about that. So it looks like it's going to be a fetch. So our opponent's probably just playing the Eidolon. And there it is. So our plan is to escalate the collective brutality on our turn. I think we just play out this Black Cleave Cliffs. And we want to use all 3 modes with our brutality. So the Blood Moon is a fine card against burn, but I think we can afford to just discard it and just discard the Lingering Souls as well, as it does have flashback and we can get value from it on our next turn that way. We can also Inquisition our opponent before the Searing Blaze that we're seeing. So I think we just go ahead, grab that Lightning Helix out of our opponent's hand and proceed. Still at a healthy life total. We can Inquisition next turn, so there's the Lava Spike that we knew about. And we're set on lands now. It looks like our opponent actually found another Searing Blaze, which is a little bit annoying. I do think we still flash back the Lingering Souls, though. It means that if or when our opponent draws a land, they can get rid of one of our spirits, but I think we're pretty far ahead here. Certainly haven't locked the game up or anything like that. So it looks like they're just going to Searing Blaze away a spirit. And it is a top deck war now. Nothing really we can do to control that, but our draws are pretty good. That was not one of them. And earlier, yes, we could have discarded a land to the brutality, but that's just a risk. Gonna go ahead and fetch, because if we do draw a Bedlam Reveler or something like that, we're gonna be happy to have double red. Okay, young Pyromancer, not the worst draw. So we'll see. We're hoping our opponent draws. Okay, they found a Helix, so we're at 8. Fatal Push could be good depending on what our opponent finds. If they find a creature, we'll be happy to have it. Wow, it looks like our opponent just keeps drawing burn, which is pretty unfortunate. Okay, Colligan's Command. That's a reasonable draw step. We don't have any creatures in the graveyard, however. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and use this Colligan's command on our opponent's draw step, just to deal them 2 damage and make them discard a card. Probably ends up discarding a land to this, but it means that now it's a 2-turn clock potentially. Well, we have, yeah, so we have our opponent at 7. By our opponent discarding a land, it means that if their last card is a Searing Blaze, it's not as good, so that is a relevant discard. And we can come in now, and essentially our opponent needs more or less to have 2 burn spells, 2 running burn spells. So we're just going to pass. Okay, they didn't cast one there, which is good. They could pass the turn and potentially try to use a removal spell, which it looks like maybe what's going to happen. Thoughtseize is not really what we want here. So if our opponent kills the young Pyromancer, I think, okay, it is a Searing Blaze. So they did have one, which made the land discard relevant. Nothing we can really do. We're hoping not to get Boros Charmed here. Unfortunately, we know that our opponent has a spell left, though. So we certainly could just lose. There's a bolt. And a Skullcrack. Shoot. Well, might have punted there. Going back to the Collective Brutality turn, might have discarded the wrong cards to the Brutality, but in any case, we flooded out. So, moving on to the sideboard. Kumbal is quite nice in the matchup. Being as we think our opponent's straight red-white, or at least not boarding in green cards, I don't know if we want Blood Moon. Night's Whisper, no, not for this matchup. Thoughtseize also isn't great. Molten Rain might be better than Blood Moon here. Unfortunately, we do have to have some pretty bad cards in our deck. But I'm going to go with this. The reason why I like the Molten Rain is that it is another instant or sorcery in the graveyard. So we are going to play here. And we do have a Lightning Helix. However, only one land. I do believe we have to mulligan this. And this hand is better. We don't have any life gain, but we do have 2 lands and an Inquisition if we want it to start. Although I think I might lead with the Sacred Foundry, because we certainly don't want to pay life for that Sacred Foundry. And it means we're able to play a turn to, say, Terminate if our opponent plays a creature more easily. There's a Goblin Guide, okay. So we have Kumbal on top, which is pretty good. And I'm just going to pass with the Terminate at the ready. Monastery Swift Spear. Okay, so we're going to kill one of these, of course. Okay, that's good. So we found an Arid Mesa. Goblin guy is currently dealing us the most damage, so I think we just get rid of it. And now I kind of like just going Young Pyromancer plus Inquisition. The Kumbal probably would die to removal. And this way we get that Inquisition out of our hand. Seeing Searing Blaze, Helix, and Boros Charm. So I think we just take the Blaze. So we have a little bit of a choice here. We can jump in front of the Swift Spear with an Elemental. Yeah, I like that. Just protecting our life total. Bolt is going to take care of the Young Pyromancer. I think I like just passing here with Colligan's command up. We know about that Lightning Helix. Currently have two spells in hand, so we want another spell in the graveyard for the Bedlam Reveler. Just going to take the 1 damage here. Our opponent does have mana available. So I think we just make them discard a card. They may have drawn a land for turn, but no need to try to kill the Swift Spear since they can just respond with a Boros Charm. And okay, so it looks like our opponent actually did discard a Lightning Helix, so that worked out pretty well. Nahiri is a pretty good draw. I think we just play it, get rid of the Swift Spear. And so basically the idea is to get Kumbal out next turn, most likely. We're not going to die this turn, we know that. I don't think we necessarily want to discard anything here, because we can just go ahead and play Kumbal and Young Pyromancer, and then still have the Bedlam Reveler. Okay, Searing Blood, that's fine. Because our opponent is still... We still get that Kumbal trigger for it. It's actually much worse than Searing Blaze right there. Well, I think we might as well just cast this Inquisition. Force our opponent to act. Okay, they have 2 lands. Well, that works out very well for us. So it looks like this is gonna cost us 4, I believe. Yeah. And we still have not used the Nahir yet. I think we just pitch the Lingering Souls. And now we're going to close out the game very quickly. Okay, yeah, our opponent saw the writing on the wall, of course. Conceded, and now, like I said, we have some awkward cards in the deck. But I don't think we really have any changes to make either. Like Molten Rain, Thoughtseize, yeah, not cards you really want in the matchup, but we clearly have some really good ones also. So, yeah, this looks fine. We've got a Inquisition for turn 1. Or we can bolt. We can also bolt. Okay, that's a Kumbal. So that's not a bad one to be drawing. I think we want to plan on bolting just to save some damage from this Goblin Guide. Although if our opponent plays an Eidolon, it's pretty bad for us. So if we want to play around Eidolon, we're not bolting here. But then the Goblin Guide is still an issue. So I think we're supposed to just bolt this away. Hope our opponent does not play land Eidolon. Okay, Grim Lavamancer. That's fine. Also missed a land drop, so this Molten Rain is looking pretty good actually now. Or even really good. And it's a bunch of burn. So I'm just gonna grab a bolt. Don't think we need to even cast the Inquisition right now. So I'm gonna play out the Bloodstained Mire. What that's going to allow us to do is get something like a Sacred Foundry into play without having to pay life. Certainly not the matchup where we want to be shocking. So we know our opponent has a bunch of gas, bunch of burn, but with only that one land, could end up working out for us. So I am going to get Sacred Foundry. Oh, that's pretty insane. There's another Molten Rain there. Well, yeah, let's just go ahead and start the Molten Rain stuff. Our opponent probably isn't too pleased with this turn of events. And it looks like still no land on the other side of the table. So we're free to deploy our Kumbal now. And our opponent's just going to concede to it. Okay, we're on the draw with a pretty decent hand that we can keep. And the looting can help us find whatever's good in the matchup. We don't know what we're playing against, of course, being as it's game 1, and then the Inquisition is good. It just allows the nice thing about Mardu is you get to play with perfect information or close to perfect information a lot of the time, and the discard spells before looting are pretty relevant for sure. So it looks like it's actually Tron that we're playing in, so that's one of the toughest matchups for the Mardu deck. Especially game 1. But it looks like, so our opponent does have a power plant, meaning they are pretty close to already having Tron and a Karn liberated. I'm going to take the Ancient Stirrings because our plan is basically to hope that our opponent doesn't find Tron, and Stirrings could allow our opponent to find that Urza's Tower. Okay, so there's the power plant we knew about. So we know our opponent still has a Walking Ballista and a Karn liberated in hand. Gonna go ahead and loot away. And as far as the discards, I think we can go ahead and pitch this Terminate pretty safely. And one of our lands. We're just kind of trying to aggressively get a threat out and hope our opponent doesn't Tron up. So I think definitely at least one land should go to the graveyard from this looting. If our opponent has the Tron land and plays Karn, it's just so rough for us that I think we just discard the Helix as well. We're hoping for no Karn. Okay, so it is going to be Karn, but you know, sure, if our opponent minuses, maybe we could have Helixed it, but then we're still not winning that exchange. So they might also just plus the Karn. Either way, it's just one of those situations where you're against Tron. Tron is a very strong deck. We didn't know about this Urza's Tower, and our opponent's ticking up Karn anyways, which is it's a good play because now we just can't get rid of it. And Yeah, I mean, we can try to get the Bedlam Reveler out there. Maybe may have discarded the wrong land there. But I don't think there's any way we're getting through this, so just gonna go to the next game. So game 2 we have a lot more game against the deck. We have Molten Rains, Surgicals are great. Because what you can do is you can Molten Rain a land, and then you can Surgical the land, and then keep the opponent off Tron. Needle is pretty decent. Got a lot of pretty solid cards. I like the Night's Whisper as well. So we're going to be taking out a lot of our removal spells, like the Fatal Pushes, Collective Brutality comes out, Lightning Helix, Terminate. Dreadbore is an interesting one, but I think it comes out as well. Basically, we're hoping that our opponent does not get to Tron. If our opponent does get to Tron, it's just very bad for us, and the plan is to have that not happen. Colligan's Command is fine because it can blow up artifacts. It's kind of a flexible type of removal spell. Cabal is also interesting in the matchup, but I think this is where we want to be. 2 bolts still on the deck. Have to keep in a little bit of removal. You want some cheap stuff. The discard is pretty good. And yeah, so we're going to keep this. It's just pretty solid hand actually, because we have the Inquisition to start off, into Young Pyromancer and Molten, and then Molten Rain. So we've got our first 3 turns already kind of mapped out. And if we draw something like a Surgical, that would be perfect. But even if we don't, sometimes 1 Molten Rain is enough to keep your opponent off Tron. Okay, so it looks like our opponent also kept their opening 7. And we don't really mind taking some damage from our fetch lands in this matchup. Tron doesn't really do that much direct damage, besides like Walking Ballista. But the whole goal is just keeping the opponent off Tron if possible. Okay, this hand is pretty good actually, because Mine, Tower, and then a bunch of spheres, scrying, so we can take, there's also an expedition map. We can take the map. It does mean that our opponent can then play a sphere into a scrying, so they are going to have the turn 3 Tron, but we have the Molten Rain before that happens. I think we just take a map. Oh wow, that's great. The second Molten Rain is going to make it much more difficult on our opponent to get Tron. So we know about 2 chromatic spheres, and then there's 3 unknown cards in our opponent's hand at the moment. We do want to get basics in case we draw Blood Moon. So I'm going to get a Swamp. And I'm just going to hit the tower. It's kind of random which one. we target, just kind of hoping that the opponent didn't draw the other one, basically. There's a power plant. And so now, still 5 cards in hand for our opponent. We're almost certainly just going to Molten Rain again on our turn. And probably get rid of the power plant because it's the one that our opponent searched for last turn, so it's less likely mathematically for our opponent to have another power plant compared to another mine because they started with an Urza's Mine already. I don't know. Tron math is hard. Playing the probabilities. So we'll see if they have naturally drawn into either a... Okay, no, they... So this is looking really good now. As our opponent just completely missed their land drop. We can actually potentially Bedlam Reveler this turn. Yeah. So we can discard. Now we have 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so we have enough to Bedlam Reveler and flashback this Lingering Soul, so it just works out perfectly. And potentially just win the game next turn. Yeah, our opponent's all the way down to 7. Even though we drew 3 lands off the Reveler, this is still... I don't see what our opponent can do. I mean, sure, they found a tower for turn, but without the plant... And there's a bolt for good measure, so we'll just go ahead and go across the finish line. But now we're going to be on the draw for game 3. So this is where things get interesting, because if our opponent has the turn 3 Tron, then the Molten Rains and Blood Moons are not fast enough. So kind of have to hope that when you're on the draw that the opponent just doesn't have it on turn 3, which is not a great feeling, but that is where we're at. We're on the draw for the final game. And I'm just going to submit. Doesn't really change our plan too much. So our opponent mulliganed quickly. We are also... I think we should mulligan this. I mean, we do have two discard spells, but we don't have... Ugh, wow. So we mulligan a 1-lander into a 0-lander. And didn't both hands have 3 Lingering Souls? Am I missing something here, or is this just the Moto Shuffler? Sometimes it does this to you. Not what you want to happen against a bad matchup on the draw, but... Looks like maybe our opponent has a decision because we're both on 6. We know we're going to 5, regardless of what our opponent does. I mean, we could scry into a black source, but yeah, against Tron, we're really just hoping to find a Molten Rain. Didn't find one in our 7 or 6, but can't really keep going down, so have to keep this. We have the Bedlam Reveler, so it's not the worst hand I've ever seen. Probably just keep the Swamp on top. We can lead on Swamp. Swamp Inquisition of Kozilek. Or Blood Crypt. I guess we just lead on the Crypt. Because we know we're playing that Crypt no matter what. So here is our opponent's hand. Okay. So it's Ancient Stirrings, Sylvan Scrying, Ballista, Thragtusk, and Forest. We know the Forest is going to be the play for the next turn. We know that our opponent scryed to the bottom, by the way. So we just take Sylvan Scrying here. Our opponent is likely going to Ancient Stirrings into... Oh, no, they immediately found another Sylvan Scrying for an Urza's Mind. That's unfortunate for us. Well, I think we just cast the Faithless Looting. Although not in love with it, because we have to discard 2 cards to it. And I think so we know our opponent's hand is Mine, Ballista, Stirrings, Thragtusk. We want to take away the Ancient Stirrings and just kind of still hope that our opponent doesn't get Tron, I think. Although, if we keep the Thoughtseize, we can take away one of these other cards, but because we mulligan down to 5, we really need all of these resources is the issue. So I am going to discard the Thoughtseize and Blackcleave Cliffs. Yeah. I think the Swamp has more value because of Blood Moon being in our deck. And then we get the Stirrings here. So we know our opponent's hand. We're trying to keep them off Tron if possible. So, assuming the mine comes down... Ugh, wow, that's brutal. Oh, absolutely brutal there. Found a tower. So now we're hoping to find a Molten Rain or a Blood Moon off the top of our library, which we did not find. Okay, well... Can't stop Tron, unfortunately, so... Can't cast Bedlam Reveler this turn, so I'm gonna loot. And we did find a Molten Rain. I think we just keep that in hand, but we'll see what our opponent plays for turn. Assume the Urza's Tower, there it is. And then, is it going to be Thragtusk or Walking Ballista? Ballista, yeah, that was a really smart play from our opponent. It's a 4/4 creature. So we can Molten Rain. So we might as well Molten Rain. Sure, we'll go for the tower. So tower down. Still in a bad spot. We can Bedlam Reveler on our next turn, but we're taking 4 down to 12, at least 4. Oh man, there's a relic. Well, that's brutal. We'll see if our opponent actually pops it here. We only have 1 card in hand. And that's just a clear mistake from our opponent not to pop it. We have 3, yeah, so we're just going to discard this young Pyromancer. They should have clearly popped the Relic of Progenitus. And we did draw into a Pithing Needle. So I'm going to cast that. See if our opponent elects to respond to it or not. And it looks like they're pinging away the Reveler. I'm pretty happy with this, actually. Because now the Ballista's gone, and we can name the Relic of Progenitus that's on the battlefield. So we'll name the Relic with the Needle, and then pass after playing Marsh Flats. So we know our opponent has Thragtusk still, and then one unknown card. And there's a basic Forest. So now we're actually back in the game. We have this Night's Whisper we drew. I think our opponent assumed we were going to name Walking Ballista with the Needle, but there were 2 permanents on the battlefield there that we could have named, and I think that was just a mistake. Oh wow, there's a Warping Well. That is brutal. That is brutal. Wow. That actually counters our Night's Whisper. Now we can't do anything because if we just cast this, we're just discarding whatever we draw, so we have to pass. Okay, Chromatic Star, so not a land to be able to cast this Thragtusk that's still sitting in our opponent's hand. Just a pass. So now we can pretty clearly Faithless Looting. I think we just discard the 2 lands and then just Faithless Looting again. Okay, so we found Surgical Extraction. So might as well cast that, get our opponent's Tron lands out of their deck. Just making sure I'm casting this on the right card. Okay, so we see a Karn liberated and Thragtusk in our opponent's hand. Quick glance over the deck list because we are looking through our opponent's deck. We see Oblivion Stone, Spatial Contortion. Okay, so the main card we're going to be worried about here is the Thragtusk. If our opponent can draw a land Thragtusk, we're still actually in a bad spot. Okay, Chromatic Sphere is good news. It means, okay, well, it did find the land. So we're now hoping to draw something that can deal with the Thragtusk, which we didn't. I'm just going to pass. And our opponents hit 2 running lands, which is bad because now the Karn is also an issue. Although we found this Lingering Souls, so might as well cast and flash that one back. Okay, Expedition Map is bad because it means that our opponent is going to have access to Karn, and they're going to also get Sanctum of Ugin, which allows them to then search up for a Walking Ballista. So pretty bad news. We have a choice here in terms of how to navigate against this Thragtusk. We can put 3 spirits in front of it. And I think we just have to do that. Unfortunately, it doesn't feel very good. But we get the 5/3 off the battlefield, so now if we draw a Thoughtseize, that would be nice, because then we could Thoughtseize away that Karn, but we didn't find one, and we're still in a pretty rough spot. Been kind of a crazy game. I thought thought we were in a decent situation, but now it looks pretty grim. Because the plan is to kind of hope that this... Once the Planeswalkers get in play, it's bad news. Okay, yeah, Karn takes up. That Warping Whale was actually pretty absurd. And with that Ballista in hand, I just don't see how we get out of this, actually. Yep, I'm just going to concede this. The Walking Ballista is going to come down. The relic getting sacrificed is bad for us too. And so even though we did take our opponent off Tron, we just didn't have a clock. Didn't draw an early creature. And the Bedlam Reveler that we did draw got shot down. Don't think our opponent played it that well, to be honest, but it is going to be good enough to win. Yep, there's just another land, so that is going to be the match.